Hi, everyone. You're listening to Buck Talk, a podcast created by members of the entomology department at Michigan State University. My name is Sophia, and my co-host today is Julie. Hi, Julie.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Yeah, Julie is a new member of our co-host team. So welcome, Julie. This is going to be your first episode. We're very excited to have you.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about Julie, she was on the podcast, on an earlier podcast where we introduced new graduate students. So hop on that and listen to it if you want to get to know her background a little bit more and what she's working on. But today we want to focus on talking to Raul Medina. Hi, Raul.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. So Raul and I have known each other for, well, let's just say a very long time. And we have worked together in the past. And so that's part of the reason I'm so excited to have you. But the other part of the reason is what we're going to be talking about today, which is some of your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But before we get into that, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself, talk about your background a little bit, however you want to cover that. So go ahead.
All right. So yes, I am Raul Medina, and as the accent will reveal, I was not born in the United States. I was born in Lima, Peru, and I came to the United States for grad school, basically. I did my undergrad in Peru in biology, and then I came to the US to be a conservation biologist with the intention to come back to Latin America to work on the protection of the tropical rainforests. But then in the process of getting my education on that, I realized that in order to be effective, at least in the tropical areas that I wanted to work with, there was way more than biology that was needed to make things work. And I was not at the time interested in that kind of work. I was more about research. And I realized that conservation biology sometimes needs a lot of extra skills that at the time I was not interested in getting. So I switched. And I went from the University of St. Louis in Missouri when I did my it was a certificate program on conservation biology. I switched to the University of Maryland when I completed my master's in insect ecology, and I stayed there for a PhD in population genetics of insects, of course. And then soon after.
Who did you work with there?
Oh yeah, like my advisor was Pedro Barbosa in Maryland. All the way. And that's important for today's talk because it is there that I seen the seed of all the diversity, equity, and inclusion, issues that later became important in my career started. He is the one that made me realize the issues without actually lecturing it about it. It was just the way he was. I mean, if you know Pedro, you know his style, right? You just have conversations with him, and he every once in a while volunteer this other information. And over the years, I became aware he was important for me. It was important for me to have him in my life because he opened my eyes to a lot of issues that being from another country you missed. And we are going to talk about that in a little bit. But he was my advisor there, and then Robert Marquis was my advisor in St. Louis, in Missouri. That's when I got interested in plant-insect interactions as my starting point into entomology. And then soon after my PhD, I got my position in A&M when I have been ever since 2006. So now I'm a full professor there, and I study basically how population genetics may affect pest control practices. That's my long-term interest. And I'm also involved a little bit with public perception of biotechnology, and of course with diversity and inclusion issues, which has been in my life since grad school, starting with those conversations with Pedro Barbosa until today. Yeah, so that's, I think, a good intro to kind of it shows what kind of things interest me, or, we can talk more about this stuff.
Yeah, before I turn it over to Julie, I just wanted to say that Pedro has been a really big influence in my life as well. I didn't work at the University of Maryland, but I worked right next door at the USDA. And so I got to know him by going to seminars and getting to know people in that department. And he and I became friends. And whenever I needed advice and mentorship, I looked to him. And so if you don't know him, you can look up his books and publications, and he has a wonderful wealth of information on biocontrol and agroecology. He's really well known for that. But beyond just being a really good scientist, he's a really good person. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd be interested in hearing what some of those early lessons that you learned in graduate school, and if anything about your transition from Peru to the U.S. If that experience, you know, also formed your early ideas in this.
Yes, actually, yeah, that was crucial to my approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. For reasons that are very different than the ones that motivate people that is born in the US and belong to an underrepresented group. Let me explain. And this is something that is nuanced, but if understood, I think it can make us look at diversity in a better way, more fine-grained than what we do sometimes in some institutions in a country. Let me explain. So when you're a foreigner, you just arrive to a new country, whatever that country is, and it takes a while for you to realize the social dynamics of that country, regardless of the country. So when you come for grad school, you're very focused to research-oriented goals in your life. And then if you're in science, in the natural sciences, that's usually, if you're going to be successful in grad school, sometimes you don't have time, but just work on your study project, right? And since you are not trained in social issues, sometimes you perceive things but you cannot verbalize them. You don't realize what is going on, and you assume the easiest explanation of everything that happens to you is like, well, I'm from another country. I don't understand, or they don't understand my accent. This is happening to me, right? So, and then, you know, you get your act together, you get to know the country better, and then you adapt in whatever niche you find is your niche in that new country, if you stay, like I did. Well, one interesting realization, and this is when Pedro became crucial to me, because having conversations with Pedro and hearing his experience being the first Black entomologist, that I knew, and then he will share a lot of experiences that he went through that sound very familiar to me. And Pedro is not foreigner, Pedro is American. He's from Puerto Rico, but moved to New York when he was maybe 3 years old, so very early on. So in my mind, he's American, but he's experiencing very similar thing. I mean, he's telling me about things about his grad school experience, sometimes even high school experience. Every once in a while, Pedro is a very private person, so he will not just tell you about his life. He doesn't like to talk about himself much. But if you start a relationship with him, every once in a while, things will come up, and he volunteers from stories. And it was important for me to realize, oh my God, like very similar. Some of his life stories resonated with some of the things I was experiencing. And I realized that maybe a little bit of what I was feeling was not my foreign status. There was something else. And then we start having those conversations maybe at the end of my master's, but it's during my PhD that he started realizing that I was interested, and he started sharing some of his hypotheses about what I was going through, kind of explaining to me all that history that I missed by growing in a different country, right? So I didn't know. I mean, when you're from another country, you get the idea of what the US is through movies and TV shows. And you get the impression that everything works like in those shows. And then when you go to a university, if you believe that, you can make it work because you're in a very protected environment and nothing happens to you. Pedro started making me realize that that's not the US. And then at the beginning, I will not agree, because the US I experienced was not the US that he was describing. And I thought that perhaps that has something to do with the past. And he was not very explicit about it, but he will say things like, well, sometimes when you are not mainstream, he will say things like that, or when you are not, perceived certain way, people treat you differently because this and that. Okay. At the time, actually, there were no popularization of terms like implicit bias or microaggression. Those things were not in the mind of entomologists, but people that were from underrepresented groups have experienced things that they didn't have a name for. So Pedro was telling me his experiences without these names that we now have, right? So little by little, I realized something very important to me, which is that because after I did my PhD here. So I was in the, and I have been, by the time I realized this, I think I have been in the US 6 years. And I realized, and I started hanging out with a lot of Hispanic Americans and a lot of African Americans in DC, people that is born in this country. And then I was hearing we started becoming friends. And I'm gay, so these were people from the gay community. And they were starting to share with me, and these are not academic people. They were waiters, or they were lawyers, and they were medical doctors, they were engineers, they were accountants, very different careers than mine. And they were all agreeing and sharing, and now verbalizing a lot of things that Pedro kind of suggests when he talked to me. I think Pedro was trying to be very diplomatic and polite and trying not to discourage me or to curb my enthusiasm of belonging to something like academia in the US. So he was not as explicit as these other people I met in the city. And then all of a sudden I realized it came like a, I remember the day I realized this, when I realized, oh my goodness, I actually belong to this community. This is my, because before I realized that, my community was the entomology department in Maryland and everybody that was there. But when I started having these friendships in the city and they start sharing all their experiences, all these instances of discrimination at work or in the street, all of a sudden I realized in one way or another, I felt similar things. Nuance are very covered in the university. I will say rarely I will experience that, but in the street I was. And then I was like, oh, and I realized something revelational to me, which is that I, in my country, was part of the mainstream. I was, in my country, the equivalent of a white guy here. But then when I moved here, just because the color of my skin, people treated me as an underrepresented group. And I, at the beginning, assumed it was because I was foreigner, but in reality, I'm really remembering a lot of instances in which people wouldn't know that because I have not even spoken before these things occurred. And I realized that I had a very unique angle because unlike my friends that were born here, always Hispanic in America, I was Hispanic from somewhere else. So I was like an African-American guy that was from Wakanda, So I knew how you could be Latin and being perceived very differently than what mainstream at the time in academia, which was mostly white when I went to grad school, perceived you. And that was the beginning of my interest in diversity and inclusion with the realization that as a foreign person, I can contribute a lot because I can do a lot of things that people born here couldn't do. And we can talk about those in a little bit because it's complicated. But it brings two issues that are important when it comes to something that is very dear to me now, which is like how institutions count underrepresented groups in their ranks. Let's talk about entomology departments. Entomology departments that praise themselves in having a lot of diversity. Many times when you look at what that diversity is in terms of Hispanic and African American, they happen to be foreign most of the time. Mm-hmm. They are not born in the US. And that's something that we can talk in a little bit. It's nuanced, but it's important. Because by counting brown people that is born in a different place, you're not doing anything to solve the diversity and inclusion issue in the United States. Because when you get people from other countries, you're getting people with privilege that already grew up in privilege, and they do not have the issues that being born as an underrepresented group brings, which is a lot of imposter syndrome. You don't have role models when you grow up. So it creates a lot of issues that you don't have when you are born somewhere else. And we can talk about that because my goal is for universities to start investing in recruiting American citizens that are underrepresented, that experience these problems, and not just filling the space with foreigners, which benefit me a lot because I got a job, but it's not right for Hispanic Americans, for example, when you go, or African Americans or anybody, Native Americans, like, we are the comfortable minority. Foreigners that are brown or black are the confident minority because they do not trigger white fragility issues, for example, in colleagues, because we are white people. We just, culturally, white people of privilege, which is what white means in the US. White doesn't mean a race. White means just you have privilege. If you are in Africa, you will be Black and you will be white in terms of privilege, you know what I mean? So it's who holds the privilege. In the United States, we call that white people, white male usually. Well, when you have foreigners, you're getting white males that are brown, you know, or that are Black. And this is difficult to understand, but if we, in the podcast, I don't know if we will have time, but my intention is for people that listen to this podcast, start thinking about these issues and start asking your colleagues. Start, if you have Hispanic American colleagues and friends, African American, Hispanic, African American colleagues and friends, start asking them how do they feel about this issue of is it the same to be brown but being born in a different country, or being Black and being born in a different country and come here for grad school versus growing, and you will hear a lot of interesting things. So don't trust me on this. Just double check with your friends and colleagues, and if they trust you, you will start hearing a lot of very interesting insights. And sometimes people that are professors or foreigners don't like this because they are like, how dare are you? I have been told this many times, but I think I have successfully navigated these conversations, and I think at the end we have still been friends with these people. But sometimes they get offended when I say things like this. For example, if I have colleagues from another country like me, and they are like, how dare do you I mean, we have a struggle too. We get discriminated too. And that's true. We do get discriminated. But we have this way more psychological tools. We deal with that discrimination that somebody that have grew up in a place as a minority from the start. The psychological tools that somebody growing up in America as Black or growing up in America as Hispanic creates literally kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder. We do not have that, or if we have it, we develop it when all our psyches are very well in place so we can take it, or at least we take it better. It's very different to experience this messaging when you are a child than experiencing this message when you're in your 20s. And I think both communities can collaborate because we can take some foreigners that are brown and Black, we can be in the front line taking all the emotional burden that talking about diversity takes without having as much impact as somebody that is born here. Talking about, if you're the only Black person in your department, for example, and you're trying to explain diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, it hurts. It takes a lot of emotional burden to do so. When you are a foreigner, it does, but way less. So we can help each other that way. We can be in the front line taking that toll because we can take it. So our colleagues that are born here don't need to go through that burden and that trauma again and again and again. And that's how I see a great service that foreign hires of brown or Black, you know, when you come across as brown or Black, you can really, first of all, recognize that you have benefit, you have some privilege, you have benefit from racism in a way. And this is difficult to take, but let me tell you, and I know I am speaking a lot, but I have a lot of things.
No, that's okay.
So you can interrupt me at any point. But for example, I consider that I have benefit from white privilege because I am sure that when I applied for my position, there were Hispanic Americans and African Americans applying perhaps, but because the way implicit bias works, perhaps their packets were not viewed as good as mine, not because I'm better, but just because I was perceived as more, as differently. You know, I was perceived as foreigner, sophisticated. You know, when I speak, my accent doesn't have the connotations that an Hispanic accent, an African American accent has in the US for issues that have to do with psychology. It's not your conscious brain deciding these things, it's your unconscious self. This is how implicit bias works. So I can say that I have benefit from this by getting the job I got, because I cannot believe. Let me tell you about my department. My department, we have a lot of Hispanic faculty, but all of us, we are 6 or 7, all of us were born in another country. Mm-hmm. I cannot believe that there is not an Hispanic American person applying for these jobs that was as good as we were, at least one. So I am telling you, implicit bias is funny because when you think about it, nobody will admit that they were thinking that way because they were not thinking that way. It's unconscious. But the data, when you aggregate things in data points, then you realize there are funny patterns emerging. And this is one of the funny patterns I see. When you look at a lot of brown people, I can talk about, it's my community, Hispanic community, but I'm sure it's maybe similar with African American hires. in entomology, when you look at the professor level, a lot of them will have been born in another country. And when you aggregate the data, I cannot believe that there are not Hispanic Americans applying for these jobs that are as qualified as we were when we were applying for the jobs. So this is a problem that I want people to be aware of, because implicit bias or unconscious bias, I will say, is impossible to fix personally. You can be aware of it, but you cannot fix it. You can fix it institutionally or in group thinking. So if you have a very functional department, you can all make a commitment to, as a group, make implicit bias powerless. Because as individuals, it's impossible, because it's unconscious. So when you do work as a committee with this realization, you check each other out. And the trick is to get to that point without feeling that you are offended when somebody called you on that. If you create that climate when everybody can call each other on their biases, you are going to have a very fair and functional department. And it takes a while, but it can be done.
I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to do this, because I think, as a person who hires, I think a lot about implicit bias in hiring. And to be honest with you, when I'm on search committees and we get DEI education or training or whatever you want to call it, this word or these words come up, but I don't feel like I'm getting any practical advice on how to overcome these implicit biases, not just in myself, but as you mentioned, in other people as well. And we usually have a DEI representative on the committee, but you're right that it's such a deep-seated issue, and I really don't know, other than the one, like I can tell you, the one concrete thing that I've been doing in my lab is to do those implicit bias tests that Harvard offers, to kind of hash through like what are your, to make you aware of what your implicit biases are. And I can leave a link to that in the show notes if anybody wants to check that out. But so beyond that, do you have any kind of action items that one could do to make people aware of these implicit biases?
Yes, thank you for the question, Sophia. That's such a great question, because the thing is that at the end of the day, we need to, first of all, entomology this is not our field, right? So we try to do the best we can, but we still need to do our research on this and that. So only people like Pedro, perhaps, and then me, because I was talking to him a lot. And then there's a couple of entomologists that we spend time. I mean, all I know about diversity, equity, and inclusion is because I took time of my research life to do research on this. So because this knowledge, I have not written as many grants as maybe I should, or as many papers, I have not published as many papers as maybe I could, because it takes education for you to get to the level when you see these things. But so unfortunately, those trainings do not work. I mean, the trainings are great for awareness, and they work for the institution to say that they are doing something for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but for the individual or for the department, awareness is the first step. So let's say I was harsh, I say they don't work. For what my goals are, which are, I want to see actionables, actually changing people's lives, the trainings don't work. But if you are thinking in the long-term gain, if you're thinking, okay, the first step is awareness, well, they work for awareness. The diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops or trainings, they work on awareness. But the sad story is that they don't work in 100% of the class. They work usually in a very few percentage of the class that have not formed a worldview or imaginary or conceptualization of the issue. So this is where things get really complicated. When you are an underrepresented person that was born in America, of course, you don't need these trainings to be aware of these issues, but you need them to verbalize your grievances. You need them to realize, oh, this thing that have happened to me is not just me. It just happened to be a thing. It's called microaggression. It's called implicit bias. It's called imposter syndrome. Okay, now you are validated as an underrepresented person taking these courses. So that group benefits a little bit because they feel validated. Now, if you are, let's say, in the mainstream, let's say, which in academia is white males, you may already have formed your opinion about how this is not real, and the course is not going to open your mind at all. You're not going to be paying the kind of attention you get. And if you are in between, maybe you will be aware, but that's the end of the story. So if you really want to make this awareness put into work to actually do effective work that takes these things into consideration, you cannot do it by yourself, because by the nature of the problem, you don't realize you're making these decisions. You need to change the group dynamic in whatever decision-making group you have. And one thing that works, in my opinion, is to have a diversity and inclusion committee in your institution that is very aware of these issues, and it is the role of the committee to recommend to the department all these strategies that need to be implemented in order for you to have effective promotion and tenure committees, effective hiring committees, effective evaluation committees. And let me tell you what it is. How does it look like? It looks like changing the climate of collegiality when it comes to this issue. So it's difficult to do, but it can be done. But it's not without a struggle. If you think you're going to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion goals without uncomfortable conversations, you are very unrealistic. Unfortunately, to see the light at the end of the tunnel, you need to go through a lot of dark moments and uncomfortable conversations in your working group. So in our department, I will say we have been successful doing this. And it took, I will say, 5 years of active, uncomfortable conversations until we got it. And I can say that when it comes to promotion and tenure, our department have achieved a level of maturity that makes me really proud, because we do check each other's biases. We disclose our biases. Sometimes, for example, the Harvard test is very good to do, because you realize that you yourself are biased against things you had no idea you were. So when you create the right climate, you can say, oh my God, surprisingly enough, or maybe not surprisingly enough, I am biased against, that test turns out I'm biased against gay people, even though I'm gay. And I am biased against native people, maybe because I grew in Peru and there was a lot of discrimination against native people, and that got into my system. I'm not biased when evaluating African-American candidates, because in my country, we have very little population of African-Americans, so I was not exposed to that kind of thing. So when everybody does that, we check each other. So when somebody calls, for example, it looked like this, and this is not only for race, also for gender and sexual orientation. Women are disproportionately affected, for example, by promotion decisions that are negative to them. And when everybody's comfortable, you say, oh, this candidate is amazing. Let's say is a guy. Oh, wonderful. And then when you have created the climate, you say, why you say amazing? And the person explains, and you're like, well, amazing for me means, I don't know, 5 publications a year and 1 grant before promotion to 10. Oh, great. Noted. Later can mean in 2 years, somebody, a woman now comes and it has the same stuff, and then somebody says, well, she's getting there. And then you say, why are you saying she's getting there? And the person say, well, 5 publications and a grant for me is just getting there. And then you remind them, well, but remember 2 years ago, we have this guy. And then if you have done your job as a committee, the person will say, oh my God, implicit bias, I'm so sorry. And you move on. Nobody feel accused of being sexist or anything. You thank your colleagues for checking on you. And when you do that, we are very comfortable as a committee deciding things fairly. So it takes a little bit of committee memory and commitment to don't use words like that, for example. There are very simple actionables. You cannot use, we try to not use words like amazing, outstanding, incredible. No, we don't use that because they are disproportionately used for guys, for example, again, and disproportionately misused for women. You don't say those things about women. You can measure these things. This is all being studied, it's not opinion. So we try to avoid words like that. And when the word is used, we want an explanation. And when the explanation is given, we know the explanation. And we now know that outstanding will mean for this committee this. So whoever has that, we will agree that now it's outstanding. That's the kind of work. And it's hard work, but I think it can be done. But it starts with the realization that we are all biased about something. Maybe you are not biased against Hispanic Americans. Maybe you are not biased against African Americans or women, but maybe you are biased against transgender colleagues. Maybe you are biased against people from rural backgrounds or with rural accents. Maybe you're biased against people that have a lot of money or come from wealth. You are always biased. Bias is not a problem for the individual, it's human. The problem is when bias or discrimination comes with power, and there are certain groups in our society that are systematically discriminated even without you getting to know them. And these are, usually African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, in academia, I would say. So yeah, you need to be aware of this. So discrimination is not the same as, discrimination is one thing and prejudice is another thing. So prejudice is human, is there. But when prejudice comes associated with power, you have discrimination. And we cannot tolerate discrimination in academia. Prejudice, well, the variation is individual. It's a human experience. But discrimination is societal, and we can fight a societal ill together. Mm-hmm. Yes. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So with that, do you have any advice or input on encouraging such conversations, or even to, individuals who are facing issues related to DEI, and, how they can advocate for themselves or how other people can advocate for them, and just have these conversations?
Yeah. Yes. And before you answer, to piggyback on that, I do find that it's shaded by ranks, within the university, right? So a lot of students are afraid to come forth with these issues to professors because there's this rank issue, and so it gets really complicated, right? How do you talk about it in that kind of situation?
It is really complicated. And then a lot of these struggles, okay, when you're talking about your individual case, when you feel you have been experiencing some type of discrimination, is a very different way of acting, like when you're taking a role of fixing the institutional issue. Like, for example, if you want to be the chair of a diversity and inclusion committee, it's a different thing than when you have been the victim of a discrimination issue, right? So I'm going to talk about them separately. Let's say you're a white guy that feels really uncomfortable about the inequities in academia, and this person have read a lot about it, and he wants to be the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. That person, whoever that person is, there is a price to pay for that in today's academic environment, and you need to be aware of that before you engage in those roles. If you want to be effective, you're going to make some enemies in the way, and that's part of the job. Now, that's one thing, and we can talk about that later. But since I think, Julie, you were asking more specifically what to do if you feel you have been the victim of a discriminatory evaluation or an unfair promotion because discriminatory issues. Well, what I advise to people that already know, because academia, we already know which are the groups that are in trouble. It's women. In our field, in entomology, it's women, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders. Those are the trouble groups. Now, Asian Americans are a minority in society, but in academia, they do not have the same problems the other groups have. So I will say that although Asian Americans are discriminated in society, within academia, the discrimination they get is not similar, or it's not the same as the other groups I mentioned. We can talk about the Asian American experience in academia is completely different to the other ones. And we can talk about that if there is time. But if you bring an Asian American professor that is aware of these inclusion issues in the Asian community, he will tell you, or she will tell you a completely different sort of issues than the other communities I have mentioned. This is just to say that diversity is diversity. So all these communities differ in the level of challenges and discrimination they experience. We can lump the African American, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Hispanic together because there are many commonalities in the way they get discriminated in academia, but then when you go into details, you realize there are nuances there too. And then not even talking about intersectionality, right? Like, for example, if you're a woman, if you're gay, transgender within these groups, then everything starts breaking into their own subcategories and they have different solutions. That's why it's so complicated. But if you're a victim of any of these groups, you already know if you're part of any of those groups, you know that it's possible that in the department you join as a graduate student or even as a professor, you may experience some challenges. So I recommend the preventive attack, which is basically when you are aware of these issues. For example, if you're interviewing for a job, it is important for you to ask, oh, do you have an office of diversity? What work how does your department work with the diversity office? If they know what you're talking about and they give you some names and some numbers and some websites, maybe that's a good department for you to go. If they have no idea what you're talking about, you know already that if you join that department, you're gonna have some challenges, right? So that's, if you are the person that like to have those challenges, you join that department and then you teach them, go ahead. But if you don't like that kind of thing, well, apply to a department that know what you're talking about, right? But let's say once you join, you can contact these offices before anything happened. And you can just say, I want to know the climate of your institution when it comes to women in science, in this particular college. Could you please tell me if there is anything I should be concerned about? I would like your advice. Could you have a mentor that I could get that is familiar with these issues? If there is somebody in your department that is a successful women scientist, you can ask her to be your mentor. You can ask for mentors that are female in different colleges. A lot of universities have women groups of scientists and professors that take assistant professors or even postdocs and advise them on things. The preventive attack is great because you have now a community that will tell you about the institution and will protect you together, will make you aware of things. And they happen to you, you will be like, oh, you know what? You can run that by that group and say, this happened to me. What do you think it is? And they will tell you, no, it doesn't seem to be. It's just like, no, you really need to write more papers. You are writing very too little papers. Or they will say, no, it's actually weird because they will have institutional memory. They will say, you know, in your department, I know that the average number of papers is way lower when they are asking. You might check on that. So the preventive attack is the best strategy for you to succeed. If you wait until a problem arises, it's already too late.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I totally agree with what you're saying, that either you create a community or you join one that's already existing, and creating the community is obviously going to be the harder. But I think if you wanted to, as a student, for example, start initiating these kinds of discussions, either with other graduate students or just with other people in your department, some of the ways that I found that worked were, well, for example, in lab meetings, promoting papers that talk about diversity so that as a lab group, you'd learn to talk about these issues and use the language around it. And it's really hard, you will find, when you haven't done this. Another thing that we have done is, as a lab, we went to trainings, online trainings together. So again, it's like we're listening to the same kinds of trainings that allow us then to discuss what happened and again get familiar with the issues, with the language around it. And then another one is this podcast. I use this as a way for me to have these kinds of conversations like the one we're having, where again, I create the community around it and allow other people to listen in on these conversations and maybe chat with us through social media if they wanted to. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I so encourage people that you don't have to be aggressively saying like, this is what happened to me and it was so negative, but you can in more subtle ways generate a discussion around it that's not looking aggressive or coming off as offensive, I guess.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, it's important that these conversations are not just being initiated by the people in these minority groups, that they're being initiated by the people in privileged groups as well, because it's a lot less intimidating than for the people in minority groups as well. So yeah, that's specifically why I asked that question, because I think it's good to know that for everyone, how to initiate these conversations, not just, people who are directly facing whatever DEI issues they're facing.
Yes, allyship is key. Allyship is key, but like I am very aware that when you're an entomologist, you're a scientist, and a lot of us go into the profession just wanted to work on research questions on bugs. And then unfortunately, when you are from an underrepresented group, you are forced sometimes to get educated in these other things that deviate from your main interest. And sometimes you get sucked into the work because you realize there is a need. And then you need to be, when you are, let's say you're a woman in science and you want to create something that make people aware, you need to be aware that some people won't have that kind of interest earlier in their career because they are focused on the science, that's what their passion is, and they might not want to get involved in these things until they realize it's an issue, which usually happens, if they are from their groups, it happens at some point in their career. If they are not from those groups, people actually, I am very hopeful because people during the pandemic have been very receptive to the issues that have happened they have been aware and they have been very moved by the issues that happened in the nation, for example, with the killing of George Floyd, which, by the way, is not the first, but I guess because we were all trapped in the pandemia, we were all paying attention to the news, but I will tell you, they have happened forever. George Floyd is not the first person that is experienced this issue. There have been many, but rarely made it into the national news. And when it did, we were all busy doing something else, so we didn't watch it. But it's happened to transgender people, to gay people all the time. But for some reason, something happened, and I'm very hopeful because all these conversations are happening in all sorts of places. But the thing is that if the momentum passes, it will just be a conversation that happened at some point. So people that is paying attention to this need to use this moment because it's a window in people's mind when they are receptive to hear about these things. And because this is still recent, they might hear you. Because allyship is key. We will get, if we get this as a group, if we all agree, for example, a society that works well is not a society in which only African Americans or Hispanic Americans realize there is discrimination. No, that's what we have been living from the beginning. It is a society in which we all agree there is discrimination. And when you saw the protest, the composition of the people going to the protest, you saw that. There were people from all ethnicities, ages, sexual orientations. We were all there as what America is supposed to be. And that gave me a lot of hope. Because before that time, you usually see most people involved in protests were the affected people, women or the African American community. But no, that was something that was different and revealing to me because maybe we're reaching maturity. Also, we need to realize that the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion is an academic field and is relatively new. I mean, if you compare them with other fields, but it has been there for a while. So now we're starting to have a lot of data points and research papers that perhaps now are bearing fruit. So it just happened that all of a sudden, perhaps now we have the theoretical tools and the data to realize that, well, now we see patterns. This is not about individual people going through things. Now we see a pattern because we have the studies now. So maybe we have reached maturity academically in the field to start demanding now some actionables. Because before people will ask you for evidence. In the beginning, in the beginning of the field, people will say, well, maybe it's this person, you don't know the entire story. Well, when you have decades of data and we have millions of data points, now we know because that's how science works. So perhaps now is the time to look at the data and start having some actionables. But as I say, the actionables more likely are going to be group thinking and group behaviors rather than the individual. Unfortunately, implicit bias cannot be fixed by the individual. It needs to be fixed by the group. So we need each other and we need everybody on the same page to be a more fair place. Yeah.
So
and there's a lot of research about this, a lot of research, so people can read.
Yeah. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to just mention that you have been awarded the ESA DI 2021 award. So congratulations on that.
Okay.
And you had mentioned that you were surprised to hear about that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you have done in the ESA and what you know about efforts at the society level.
Okay, so let me talk about, well, why was I surprised? Because I was surprised because from the beginning of my career, I have worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in what I call the backstage. So basically, my thing has been to train the stars on these issues. So I have trained undergrad and graduate students. of underrepresented groups to be the stars, and people that was born in the US because I think they understand the issue better. So at the beginning, when I started my career, I thought very naively that I will be a role model for Hispanic people in science. And very soon, when I was trying to be one, I was told by somebody, an Hispanic American person, an undergrad student, he told me, well, when we hear you talk, we don't identify with you because you're a foreign person. We don't have the same experiences. And then that I realized, yeah, hello. So since he told me that, we are now very good friends. He went to Penn State for, his name is Jonathan Hernandez, he told me that. He went to Penn State for a master's and now he's working for a company. But he actually was very aware of a lot of issues because he experienced them since he was a child. He's a brilliant person and he have been told things that I don't want to share here because they are painful, but he have been told things from high school to, I mean, mostly in high school, things that nobody wants to hear. So he educated me about how it is to be Hispanic American in America. And since that, since that happened, and even before that, but definitely strongly since that happened, my role has been trained people born here to become the stars of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So usually my undergrad and graduate students, and in the society, people that I advise through a Latin American and Hispanic symposia that we have organized. I started that with Silvia Rondon and Ale Grande, and then now we basically handed it to the new talents that they are taking it over. But in there, I met a lot of people, and my role has been to advise their careers. Sometimes they were international, but a lot of them were from here. So I was surprised because I didn't realize people was noticing these things because the stars are my students or the people I advise. So I was very pleased to hear that, oh, maybe over the years, I guess the word is out. And also I have been very invested in women in sciences. All my students in my recent cohort are women. And some of my colleagues have opened my eyes from the beginning of my career about the challenges that women face in entomology and in science in general that I wasn't aware of because I'm a guy. So that's another thing I have been. So I don't know to who I wrote this, but when they gave me the award, I said, thank you very much, but I will be happy the day in which the award is given to a Hispanic American and African American or Native American or Pacific Islander women born in the US, and then I will be happy because right now I'm very humbled by it, but I think there is a lot of people doing the work that should be rewarded and awarded. So I hope this is the first time they offer the award. So I hope the next time is one of the people I train or some of the people that is doing great work in the ground, but there is a lot of people doing amazing work at all levels, in extension, in undergrad education, graduate education, administration, a lot of Hispanic people and African American people, Pacific Islanders that have committed a lot of energy and are doing amazing work. So that's why I was a little bit surprised because I think there is a lot of people doing way more things than I do on these issues. And the other question was the society.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will report that when you look at our society, our Entomological Society of America, I think is doing a very good job trying to improve the situation of underrepresented groups in the society. I was very pleased I joined the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee maybe 3 years ago, and I was pleased to see the level of maturity of the discussions that happened at that committee. People were thinking not just about low-hanging fruit diversity, but all levels of diversity. And they were having very nuanced conversations. I was very pleased to see that committee working and doing things. And I will say that I don't know if I can share, let me see. Our society is very mindful about the challenges that underrepresented groups experience. And as a society is trying to make everybody feel welcome. If you're familiar with the discussions about changing the linear games, that's an example of something that took a lot of deliberation and conversations. And at the end of the day, I think the right thing happened. They changed the name, even though I heard from a lot, and this is one of the instances in which I was talking with a lot of people, but I was not the face of it, but I was talking with a lot of people involved in the changing of the name. And at the end of the day is that in reality, all things that have to do with these issues happen through deliberation. It's through deliberation, discussing among different people with different points of view, that you realize how to fix the problem more effectively. And there were very good arguments for not changing the name. For example, anachronistic issues. How can you judge a person that died so many centuries ago? That's a very valid issue. And there were many issues like that. But there were also very good reasons to change the name. And as a society, with the mission that we have, the right thing to do was to change the name. So perhaps academically speaking, yeah, you cannot judge somebody that died so many years ago about this, about that. It's not about that. It was not about judging Linnaeus. It was not about the past. It was about the present. It was about making our membership that feel offended by something feel validated, regardless of if the reason by which they feel offended is academically 100% validated or not. They felt offended. So we're a society. So our goal was to make membership feel included, not a jury on Linnaeus, which already died. So that was not the issue. So I am glad that the society took the right approach, because we're a professional society. We are not a jury for Dr. Linnaeus, right? So like that, several other things that are not as advertised, but the society is doing to make itself more inclusive. For example, the use of pronouns in the IDs, in the IDs for the meeting. Now we're also start thinking about one of the most neglected groups when it comes to diversity and inclusion, which is mothers. So we're starting to have conversation about professional colleagues of us that are mothers, and they want to go to the meeting, but they have kids and they want to go up in their career, but there are things that are not working great for mothers. And there are a couple of society members that are very active in these conversations, and they have brought the issue, I believe, to the diversity and inclusion, and I expect to see some changes. We are starting the deliberation, so it takes time for societies to make changes that actually are actionable. But the fact that we're starting to think about mothers tells me the level of maturity we have as a society.
Do you have student members on that committee?
Yes, I did. Jocelyn Hall was there. I don't know if she's still there. But yeah, I do have some student members in that committee. I mean, from my lab, but actually we always have some student representatives there. And our students are amazing. When you talk with our student members of the society, the level of maturity they have when it comes to diversity and inclusion compared to the level of maturity there was when I was a student, it's just day and night. It gives me a lot of hope. And this is not just underrepresented groups. White guys are very aware. White guys are the majority, and there are many white guys that are for the cause of diversity and inclusion there, and they understand that to have a functional society, we have everybody being heard, and everybody feeling welcome. And seeing that when we organize diversity and inclusion meetings, you see the audience, there are a lot of white guys there, and they are participating, and they are passionate about it. Sometimes they are even speakers. That makes me really hopeful, because I still remember the days in which you have meetings about women in science and the entire audience was women. There was not a single guy in the audience for that topic. That have changed, and that makes me extremely happy, extremely happy.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Raul, for coming onto the podcast today. And I feel like we have just scratched the surface here. We could have you back and talk so much more about this. I have so many questions, and it's just such a joy to be talking to you about this. I can't tell you how pleased I am. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It was amazing. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And thanks, everyone, for listening to Buck Talk today. We will see you in the next podcast episode. Bye, everyone.